All right, so we're here for the final class in our Lenten study of the events of Holy Week. And today we're going to be looking at the biblical accounts of the crucifixion of Jesus. These would be the events that we commemorate on Good Friday each year. And the references will be pulling from various of these, but if you would like to write them down and study at home, we'll be looking at Matthew chapter 27, verses 32 to 66, Mark chapter 15, verses 21 to 47, Luke 23, verses 26 to 55, and John chapter 19, verses 16 to 42. So to start with, we left off last time with Jesus having been found guilty and condemned to death by crucifixion. We pick back up, I'm going to be reading from the Gospel account of Mark, chapter 15, verse 20. Then they led Jesus out to crucify him. And a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it, and they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was the third hour when they crucified Jesus. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days? Come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Christ, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At the 6th hour darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." One man ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone, let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joses, and Salome. In Galilee these women had followed Jesus and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. So a few things of note here regarding the crucifixion. First, just to look at the time frame. So the way that they told time is time began basically at sunrise, and roughly 6 a.m. Would have been the beginning of the day. So the third hour would be 9 a.m. when the crucifixion began, when Jesus was hung on the cross. And we read that after 3 hours on the cross, at the 6th hour, or 12 p.m., the sky went dark. Darkness overtook the land, and the sun did not shine. And then at 3 p.m. was when Jesus breathed his last. And at 3 p.m. is when the curtain in the temple was torn. The other gospel accounts note that there were earthquakes, that there were events that were very unusual for the time, eclipses and earthquakes, events that when the gospel accounts were written, people were still living that could go back and check and say, "Yeah, no, I was in Jerusalem that day. It didn't really get dark." If those things had not happened, they would not be recorded in the Gospels. The other thing to note here is the list of people a very, very specific list of people that were involved in there for the crucifixion. So the crucifixion was carried out by the Roman authorities. We read that a centurion was there. He's not mentioned by name, but others that were there are mentioned by name. Simon of Cyrene and his sons Alexander and Rufus. Now, he apparently was just a passerby that was recruited to help carry the cross of Jesus from the city to Golgotha, which would have been the place outside of the city where he was crucified. And then we have a list particularly of women that were present there for the crucifixion. Mary from Magdala, Mary the mother of James and Joses, Salome, and other women. And it's interesting to note that of the disciples, the 12 disciples, the male disciples, Judas at this point had hung himself out of shame over betraying Jesus. But the other 11, it's only noted that John, the disciple John, would have been present at the crucifixion. The other disciples are not mentioned. They were not present. At this point, they likely were in hiding in fear for their own lives. So where Jesus was crucified would have been a place called Golgotha. It actually means in Aramaic the skull. Likely it was a hill area, someplace that could be seen and very visible. We know that it was outside of the city walls of Jerusalem, outside of the city, beyond the gate. And we know that it was on a major road, possibly the road to Emmaus, that would have gone to the north and west, leaving Jerusalem. And interestingly, Golgotha, or skull in Aramaic, then was translated to Calvaria, where we get our English word cranium. And it is from the Latin word Calvaria where we hear the phrase Calvary, or the cross of Calvary, that Jesus was crucified on Calvary. So, again, we get a lot of description that supports the historicity of the crucifixion account. People are listed by name that are still alive, that can be interviewed, that can be asked about the events that had taken place. Looking now at what I feel is one of the most important symbolic moments of the crucifixion and the crucifixion account, I want to look at the reference to the temple curtain. So we read in Mark's account, and in other gospel accounts as well, but in Mark 15, I believe it was verse 38, we read that the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, the curtain would have referenced the curtain that divided the holy place from the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. And the Jews believed that God resided within the Holy of Holies, and only one day of the year on the Jewish calendar was anyone allowed to enter the Holy of Holies, and that was the high priest, and it was on the Day of Atonement, when an animal was sacrificed for the sins of Israel. So looking back at Leviticus chapter 16, I want to read a few verses that just talk about the Day of Atonement so that we can get the full context and meaning of the temple curtain and the symbolism that occurred there. So in Leviticus 16, it says that Aaron the high priest shall then slaughter the goat for the sin offering of the people, and take its blood behind the curtain and do with it as he did with the bull's blood. He shall sprinkle it on the atonement cover and in front of it. In this way he will make atonement for the most holy place because of the uncleanness and rebellion of the Israelites, whatever their sins have been. He is to do the same for the tent of meeting, which is among them in the midst of their uncleanness. No one is to be in the tent of meeting from the time Aaron goes in to make atonement in the most holy place until he comes out, having made atonement for himself, his household, and the whole community of Israel. So it was extremely revered that the curtain in this division between the presence of God and the presence of men. This was something that was highly valued by the Israelites and by the ruling authorities. So it must have been quite a spectacle to see that temple curtain torn in two. We even read in Josephus, the Roman historian of Jewish birth, he references the temple curtain. And in the Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus writes, "When Moses distinguished the tabernacle into 3 parts, and allowed 2 of them to the priests as a place accessible and common, he denoted the land and the sea, these being of general access to all. But he set apart the 3rd division for God, because heaven is inaccessible to men." So that was what Josephus wrote, a non-Christian historian, Roman historian, regarding the temple curtain. We then see a few places in the book of Hebrews where the temple curtain is referenced again, and the symbolism and the meaning of what happened when that was torn asunder. Hebrews chapter 6, verses 19 and 20. "We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain, where Jesus, who went before us, has entered on our behalf." And then Hebrews chapter 9, verse 11 and following. "When Christ came as high priest of the good things that are already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not man-made, that is to say, not a part of creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption." And then Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 to 24. "Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is his body, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds." So again and again here we see the temple curtain being referenced as a division between man and God. And upon Jesus' death on the cross, his atoning sacrifice, his shed blood for the sins of the world, ripped that curtain asunder and opened the way for man to be in the very presence of the most holy God. It was through Jesus' death on the cross that atonement was bought, and then through his resurrection on Easter Sunday that we have the hope of our own eternal resurrection. So at 3 p.m., Jesus died. And then we read in John chapter 19, verse 38, "Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because he feared the Jews. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the 2 of them wrapped it with the spices and strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. At the place where Jesus was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there." So we need to remember that these events took place on Good Friday, the day before the Sabbath. And the Jews celebrated their Sabbath on Saturday, and the Sabbath began at sundown on Friday night. So they had to get the body down from the cross, prepare it for burial, and get it in the tomb before sundown Friday evening. And we see again here the introduction of a couple of unfamiliar faces, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Nicodemus was a Pharisee Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin that condemned Jesus to death. Joseph of Arimathea was not present at the condemnation of Jesus, but the remainder of the Sanhedrin unanimously condemned Jesus to death. So here, again, we see all of the other disciples, the popular names that we know, John, Matthew, Andrew, Philip, they're not here with Jesus in his last moments. It's the women, it's Simon of Cyrene, it's Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, both secret disciples of Jesus who now, at his death, come out and boldly go to Pilate and ask for the body and give Jesus a proper burial. Oftentimes bodies were left on the crosses to be pecked by birds and destroyed that way as a sign or a warning for other criminals. But it was Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus who boldly went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body to at least give him that dignity. So here we leave Jesus on a cold slab of stone in a borrowed tomb, abandoned by his disciples, abandoned by his closest followers, alone and dead on Good Friday, having paid for our salvation with his shed blood. It seems at the end of Good Friday that all hope is lost, but that's not the end of the story. For the rest of the story, come back to BG's YouTube site on Easter morning and hear the good news of Jesus' resurrection.